Chapter 1. The Testimony. Detective Laura Bishop had seen her fair share of chaos, but nothing prepared her for the wreckage before her. Blood stained the cracked linoleum of the old apartment building, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of violence. The scene was a grim tapestry of broken lives, shattered picture frames, overturned furniture, and the lifeless bodies of 5 people who, only hours earlier, had been alive. The sole survivor, a young woman named Elena Ruiz, sat shivering under a blanket, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed permanently etched into her face. Her hands trembled as she clutched a cup of water, her knuckles white, as if letting go would plunge her back into that nightmare. Laura studied her, wondering how much of the story this fragile woman could bear to tell. "We need to know what happened here, Elena," Laura said softly, trying to coax her into speaking. "You're safe now. No one can hurt you." Elena's eyes darted around the room, as if expecting a shadow to emerge from every corner. She finally met Laura's gaze, and the fear in her eyes seemed to pierce right through the detective's hardened exterior. They said they would come back for me," Elena whispered, her voice cracking like dry leaves underfoot. "They said I was a loose end that needed tying up." Laura felt a chill crawl up her spine. Whoever they were, they clearly didn't intend for Elena to walk away from this massacre. The urgency to protect this witness surged through her veins, stronger than the protocol that usually governed her actions. "We're not going to let that happen," Laura assured, though doubt crept into her voice. "We'll put you under protective custody. No one's going to touch you as long as we're on watch." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was already too close. She signaled to her partner, Detective Eric Monroe, to set up a secure location. Every moment they delayed could mean giving Elena's pursuers another chance to find her. Elena's gaze never left Laura's face, as if searching for cracks in her promise. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke again. "They were here for something. Something they didn't find?" Laura's eyes narrowed. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was targeted. "What do you mean? What were they looking for?" Elena opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, the lights in the room flickered, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed them whole, and the sound of the power outage was soon drowned out by the echo of a single gunshot from outside. In the dim emergency light that flickered on, Laura could see Elena's face, drained of color. She grabbed her service weapon, her eyes meeting Monroe's. "We need to move. Now." As they ushered Elena out of the room, Laura couldn't help but wonder if they were already too late. Would they be able to keep the last witness alive long enough to tell her story? Enjoying the suspense? Subscribe and share to stay tuned for the next thrilling twist. Chapter 2. The Escape. Detective Monroe led the way down the narrow hallway, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet, while Laura kept a firm grip on Elena's arm. The power outage had plunged the building into a state of confusion, with residents peeking from behind their doors, whispering in fear. Laura's instincts screamed at her to stay alert. Whatever was happening outside was far from over. "Stay close," she whispered to Elena, who nodded, her wide eyes reflecting the emergency lights. They reached the stairwell, and Monroe held up a hand to signal silence. He listened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows below. Then they heard it, a faint scuffle, like someone shifting their weight. Laura's pulse quickened. The attackers were already inside. "Go," Monroe mouthed urgently, pushing Elena ahead of him as they hurried down the stairs. The creak of the steps echoed through the silent stairwell, making every movement feel amplified, every breath loud enough to give them away. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, blocking their path. He was dressed in black from head to toe, a mask covering his face, and in his hand, he held a silenced pistol aimed directly at Elena. Without a second thought, Laura threw herself in front of Elena, her own weapon firing in quick succession. The assailant staggered back, clutching his side, but before he could react, Monroe tackled him, the two men crashing into the wall with a thud. "Run, Elena!" Laura shouted, her voice hoarse with urgency. "Get to the car." Elena hesitated for a split second, her terror making her feet feel like lead. Then, like a dam breaking, she sprinted down the remaining stairs, her breath ragged. Laura covered her, each step driving her deeper into a battle with the gnawing fear that they were walking straight into a trap. As they reached the ground floor, the front entrance exploded in a shower of glass. Another masked figure kicked in the door, his weapon raised. Laura fired again, her aim steady despite the chaos, and the figure crumpled to the ground. Monroe appeared at her side, slightly out of breath but unharmed. "They're not giving up, are they?" he said, his face tense with determination. Laura shook her head. "No, they're not. And that means Elena has something they're willing to kill for." The three of them dashed towards the unmarked police car parked at the curb. Monroe threw open the back door, shoving Elena inside before he slid into the driver's seat. Laura took the front passenger seat, her eyes scanning the streets for any signs of pursuit. As the car roared to life, Monroe hit the gas, and they sped off into the night, tires screeching against the pavement. The city lights flashed by, casting fleeting shadows on Elena's pale face in the back seat. She seemed to be shrinking into herself, as if trying to disappear. "What aren't you telling us, Elena?" Laura demanded, turning in her seat to face the terrified woman. "We can't protect you if we don't know what's going on." Elena opened her mouth, hesitated, then finally said, "They think I know where it is. The proof. The evidence that could put them all away." Laura exchanged a sharp glance with Monroe. "Evidence? Proof?" This wasn't just a murder, it was part of something much larger. "What evidence, Elena?" Laura pressed. "Who are they?" Elena's next words came out in a whisper, barely audible over the roar of the engine. "They call themselves the Circle. And they won't stop until I'm dead." Laura felt a cold wave of dread settle over her. The Circle was no ordinary criminal organization. They were ruthless, calculating, and nearly impossible to bring down. And now, they were hunting the last witness. Hooked by the suspense? Hit that subscribe button and share to find out what happens next. Chapter 3. The Safe House. They arrived at the safe house in a secluded part of town, a nondescript building surrounded by tall trees that offered cover from prying eyes. Monroe killed the engine, and Laura scanned the area, her trained eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement. "Let's move quickly," she said, her voice steady but urgent. She reached for Elena, who still seemed paralyzed by fear, her hands clutching her seatbelt as if it were a lifeline. "This place is secure, but we can't afford to stay in one spot too long." Elena nodded, her face pale and drawn, and allowed herself to be led into the building. Monroe punched a code into the electronic lock, and the door opened with a soft click. Inside, the safe house was stark and utilitarian, a single room with reinforced windows, a couple of metal chairs, a table, and a small cot in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Laura set Elena down on the cot while Monroe checked the perimeter for surveillance breaches. "You need to tell us everything you know about the Circle, Elena," Laura said, crouching down to meet her eyes. "If we're going to protect you, we need the full picture." Elena swallowed hard, her gaze distant, as if she were replaying a memory too painful to put into words. "They were looking for a ledger," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "A list of names, people in power who work for them, who keep their secrets hidden. I saw it once, by accident. That's why they want me dead." Laura felt a sinking sensation in her chest. A ledger that could expose the Circle's network of allies and informants, politicians, law enforcement, corporate executives. No wonder they were desperate to silence Elena. If that list ever came to light, it would destroy everything they'd built. "Where is the ledger now?" Monroe asked, returning from his check, his eyes fixed on Elena with a mix of urgency and skepticism. "I don't know," Elena admitted, her voice trembling. "But I know who does. It's hidden with someone I used to trust, someone who..." Before she could finish, the lights in the room flickered, and a cold draft blew through the space. Laura's eyes shot to the windows, then the door. It was too soon for the wind to reach them here. Something was wrong. Without warning, a loud crash echoed through the room as the door burst open. Masked figures stormed in, weapons drawn. They moved like shadows, quick and silent. Monroe reacted instantly, pulling his gun and firing, but he was outnumbered. Laura grabbed Elena, pushing her towards the far corner, trying to shield her from the line of fire. She raised her weapon, taking aim at the closest assailant, and managed to drop him with a single shot. But more kept coming, their eyes locked on Elena, their focus unbreakable. "Get down," Laura shouted, grabbing a chair and flinging it at the nearest attacker, buying them a few precious seconds. Monroe was wrestling with another intruder, the two of them locked in a brutal struggle, neither willing to give an inch. "Laura, they're not stopping." Monroe grunted, throwing a punch that landed squarely on his opponent's jaw. "I know," Laura shouted back, her voice straining with the effort of holding off two more attackers. The room was a whirlwind of chaos, gunfire, shouts, the crash of furniture splintering. And in the middle of it all, Elena, frozen in terror. "Go for the panic room," Laura yelled to Elena. "Now." Elena snapped out of her daze and made a run for the hidden door in the wall. Laura covered her, her shots precise and controlled, every movement focused on keeping the attackers away from the only thing that mattered, the witness who could bring the circle to its knees. Just as Elena reached the door, one of the masked figures lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. She screamed, the sound raw and desperate, as Laura turned, her finger already squeezing the trigger. In a split second, the figure released Elena and crumpled to the floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. Monroe, breathing hard, secured the door behind them, trapping the rest of the attackers outside. Elena was safe. For now. Laura lowered her weapon, her hands shaking from adrenaline. She locked eyes with Elena, who was shaking uncontrollably but alive. "We're not done yet," Laura said, her voice rough but resolute. "This is only the beginning. Can't wait to see how the story unfolds?" Subscribe and share to catch the next thrilling chapter. Would you like me to proceed with Chapter 4? Chapter 4. The Betrayal. The door to the panic room sealed with a heavy, metallic clang, the kind that sent a shiver through the spine. Inside, Elena sat huddled against the cold steel wall, her face hidden in her hands. Laura and Monroe exchanged glances, they knew the worst was yet to come. "Elena," Laura said softly, kneeling beside her. "You said you trusted someone with the ledger. Who is it? We need to reach them before the circle does." Elena looked up, her eyes red and glassy. "His name is Mark Benson," she whispered. "He used to be my fiancé, before all of this. He said he'd protect me, that he'd hide the ledger somewhere safe. But now, I don't know who to trust anymore." Laura's mind raced. The name Mark Benson wasn't new to her. He was a former journalist turned whistleblower, known for digging up the dirt that no one else dared to touch. But if Benson was as clean as Elena believed, why hadn't he come forward with the ledger already? Why hide it? "Where can we find him?" Monroe asked, his voice tense. "Because if he has that ledger, he's in just as much danger as you are." "He's got a cabin up north," Elena replied, her voice shaking. "But I'm not sure if he'll even be there." I think he's hiding, too." Monroe nodded, already pulling out his phone to call in backup for a coordinated move. But as he raised it to his ear, his expression changed, a tight frown forming on his face. He stared at the screen, then at Laura. "Something's not right," he muttered. "I can't get through. It's like our comms are jammed." Laura's eyes narrowed. "That means they're closer than we thought." Before she could say more, the wall of the panic room vibrated with the impact of a heavy thud. Then another, and another. Someone, or something, was trying to breach their supposedly impenetrable refuge. Laura's grip tightened on her weapon as she rose to her feet. "How did they find us so quickly?" Monroe muttered, his eyes scanning the room for possible escape routes. "This place is off the grid." And then it hit Laura like a punch to the gut. There was only one explanation, a leak, a mole. Someone inside the police force, or maybe even closer, someone who knew their every move. "Elena," Laura said slowly, her eyes fixed on the young woman, "is there anyone else you told about us? Anyone at all?" Elena's face went pale, and she opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. She looked terrified, not just of the intruders but of something deeper, a realization that had just dawned on her. Just then, Monroe's phone buzzed to life with a single incoming message. He checked it, and his face went ashen. "It's from Benson," he said, his voice hollow. "He's not at the cabin. He's been working with them all along." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Elena's face crumpled in disbelief, and she whispered, "No, that can't be true. He promised he'd protect me." Laura's jaw clenched. "That's how they've been tracking us. Benson's been feeding them information, leading us straight into a trap." The panic room door shuddered violently, and a crack appeared in its surface. Time was running out. Laura's mind raced as she calculated their options. They had to get out of here before the breach. "We're not waiting around to be sitting ducks," she said, grabbing Monroe by the arm and yanking him toward the hidden escape hatch. "We're taking Elena, and we're going to get that ledger ourselves." Elena hesitated, her face a mask of anguish. "But Mark, why would he do this? He loved me." Laura's voice softened for the briefest moment. "Love can be a powerful weapon, Elena. Sometimes, it's the sharpest blade they use against us." The hidden hatch opened with a hiss, revealing a narrow tunnel that led out into the woods beyond the safe house. Laura led the way, her weapon at the ready, while Monroe brought up the rear, his eyes never leaving the door that was about to give way. As they disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, the last thing they heard was the explosion of the panic room door being blown off its hinges. The circle was inside. And now, the real chase was on. Loving the tension? Hit that subscribe button and share to keep following the twists and turns of this gripping story. Chapter 5. The Hunt. The tunnel was narrow and suffocating, with barely enough room for them to move single file. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and their footsteps echoed off the cold stone walls. Laura kept her gun trained ahead, her senses on high alert, every nerve in her body thrumming with the urgency to get Elena to safety. Behind her, Elena's breaths came out in ragged gasps, each one louder than the last. Monroe followed close, his eyes flicking over his shoulder every few seconds, watching for any sign that they were being followed. The adrenaline that had been keeping them sharp was beginning to wear thin, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. "We have to keep moving," Laura urged, glancing back at Elena. "We're too close to give up now. Benson's betrayal doesn't mean we've lost." Elena's eyes were hollow, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I can't believe it was him all along. I trusted him with everything, my life, that ledger. How could he do this to me?" "Betrayal often comes from the ones closest to us," Monroe said quietly. "That's how they get inside, how they know where to strike. It's not your fault, Elena." But even as he spoke, Laura's mind was racing. The circle had to be more than just a shadowy syndicate if they were willing to plant someone like Benson so close to Elena. This went deeper than they ever imagined, and now, they were tangled in its web. The tunnel finally opened up into a clearing surrounded by thick woods. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the ground. They emerged into the open, and Laura's eyes immediately scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. "There," she said, pointing to a dirt path barely visible through the underbrush. "That's our best shot at getting out without them spotting us. Keep low and stay quiet." They moved quickly, ducking under branches and pushing through the dense undergrowth. Laura could feel the presence of their pursuers, like a dark cloud looming just beyond sight. The circle's operatives weren't just following them, they were herding them, guiding them toward a specific destination. And that's when Laura saw it, a silhouette in the distance, standing perfectly still, waiting. As they drew closer, the shape became clearer, the features unmistakable. It was Mark Benson. "Stop," Laura ordered, holding out her arm to block Elena's path. "Don't go any closer." Elena's eyes widened with a mix of horror and hope. "Mark? Why? Why are you doing this?" Benson stepped forward, his face unreadable under the moonlight. "You don't understand, Elena," he said, his voice calm, almost pleading. "I'm doing this for us, for our future. The circle, they promised me we'd be safe, that they'd make all of this go away if I just handed over the ledger." Laura's grip on her gun tightened. "You sold her out for a deal? For protection? Do you have any idea what they'll do to her once they get what they want?" Benson's eyes flicked to Laura, then back to Elena. "It's not like that," he insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "I didn't have a choice. They've got eyes everywhere, they control everything. It's the only way we survive this." "Survive?" Elena's voice cracked, disbelief etched into every word. "You call this survival? Handing me over to them is survival to you?" Before Benson could answer, the sound of footsteps and rustling leaves surrounded them. Dozens of masked figures emerged from the darkness, their weapons trained on Laura, Monroe, and Elena. They were completely surrounded. Laura's mind raced as she calculated their options, which were rapidly shrinking to zero. She locked eyes with Benson one last time. "You've made a mistake," she said coldly. "They don't leave witnesses. Not even traitors? Benson's face paled as the reality of his situation dawned on him. His eyes flicked toward the masked men, and he saw it in their expressions, the same cold, emotionless gaze they had when they hunted Elena. They weren't here to negotiate. In a flash, the leader of the operatives raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Benson. A single shot echoed through the forest, and Benson staggered back, a look of shock on his face as he crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted. Laura and Monroe dove for cover, pulling Elena down with them. Gunfire lit up the night, bullets tearing through the trees, snapping branches, and kicking up dirt. The circle's men were relentless, their aim focused on one target, the last witness. Laura returned fire, her movements precise and calculated, each shot a desperate attempt to keep Elena alive. Monroe fired in quick succession, his jaw clenched with determination, as they fought their way toward the narrow path that led deeper into the woods. "We have to move," Laura shouted, dragging Elena to her feet as they broke into a run. "This isn't over yet." As they disappeared into the darkness of the forest, Elena looked back one last time at Benson's lifeless body, a mix of anger and sadness washing over her. The men she once loved had betrayed her, and in the end, he paid the ultimate price. But the game was far from over. Hooked by the intensity? Hit subscribe and share to stay with us for the next explosive twist. Chapter 6. The Final Revelation. The forest closed in around them, the trees pressing like silent sentinels against the path they were blazing. Laura, Monroe, and Elena ran with every ounce of strength they had left, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The circle's operatives were still on their trail, their footsteps echoing through the night, never far behind. They reached a small clearing, where Laura stopped abruptly, raising her hand to signal silence. Monroe crouched low, his eyes darting between the trees, while Elena struggled to steady her breathing, her face pale and glistening with sweat. "Listen," Laura whispered, her voice sharp with urgency. "This is where we make our stand. We can't outrun them, but we can outthink them." Monroe nodded, his jaw set in determination. "They're expecting us to keep running. If we turn the tables, we might catch them off guard." Laura's gaze shifted to Elena. "Do you still remember where that ledger might be? Any clue could help us turn this around." Elena hesitated, her eyes darting nervously as memories flashed across her mind. "There was a phrase," she said slowly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Mark used to say it when he was nervous about something. 'The past is buried where no one will find it.' He said it all the time, almost like a code." "The past is buried," Laura repeated, her mind working through the puzzle. Then, suddenly, it clicked. "The cemetery. There's an old graveyard not far from here, abandoned for years. If he was hiding the ledger anywhere, that's where it'll be." Monroe's eyes met Laura's, and they both nodded. It was their only shot. "We head to the cemetery," Monroe said. "But we need to do it fast. We've got maybe minutes before they're on top of us." They turned and sprinted towards the east, where the trees began to thin out, revealing a faint, weathered path leading to the cemetery. The silence of the night was broken only by their footsteps and the distant murmur of their pursuers closing in. They reached the cemetery gates, rusted and forgotten, creaking as Laura pushed them open. Weeds and wild grass covered the ground, while headstones lay in disarray, cracked and overgrown. It was a place that time had abandoned, much like the secrets hidden within. Elena pointed to a large, crumbling mausoleum near the center. "That's where he said he'd hide things, where no one would look twice." Laura and Monroe moved quickly, prying open the mausoleum's heavy door, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, dust swirled around ancient stone coffins. In the far corner, a small metal box was hidden behind a loose slab. Laura reached for it, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled it free. "It's here," she breathed, opening the box to reveal a stack of documents, bound together with twine. The ledger. Before they could react, the night exploded with light. Flashlights surrounded them, and the masked operatives of the circle stepped into view, their weapons aimed with lethal precision. They had been herded, trapped. "You've led us right to it," a voice called out. It was smooth, confident, with a hint of amusement. The leader of the circle stepped forward, his face partially hidden under a hood, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "All this trouble for a little book of secrets." Laura stepped in front of Elena, shielding her from the man's gaze. If you think we're handing this over without a fight, you're wrong. The leader smirked, raising a hand to signal his men. Oh, I'm counting on a fight, detective. But unfortunately for you, this game was over before it began. You were never supposed to win. Monroe's eyes locked onto Laura's, a silent understanding passing between them. In a split second, he threw something from his pocket, a smoke bomb that burst into a cloud of dense fog, blinding the operatives. Shots rang out in the chaos, but Laura and Monroe grabbed Elena, making a desperate dash into the maze of headstones. Bullets whizzed past them, striking stone and earth, but they kept moving, zigzagging through the graves. Laura felt the ground beneath her shift, and they stumbled into a hollow where they could finally catch their breath, hidden from view. We need to get this ledger to the press, to someone who can make it public, Monroe said, urgency lacing his words. It's our only leverage against them now. Elena looked up, her eyes clearer than they had been since the nightmare began. No, she said firmly. I'm going to do it. I'm done running. If the circle wants to silence me, they'll have to do it while the whole world is watching. Laura nodded, a smile breaking through her exhaustion. That's the spirit. We fight back. We expose them. As they prepared to make their move, the fog began to lift, and the voices of the circle's men grew closer again. But this time, Laura felt something different, a shift in the air, the weight of fear finally giving way to the hope of justice. And as they slipped away into the night, the ledger clutched in Elena's hands, they knew that the battle wasn't over. The war had just begun. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and let us know your thoughts in the comments.